She came to the desert with one trunk, 31 years of grief, and a letter from a man she'd never met. What she found when she arrived wasn't a home. It was a graveyard of dead wood and broken promises, rows of dying vines stretching across cracked earth like something had already given up long before she got there. Gideon Vale hadn't told her any of that in his advertisement. But Serena Holloway didn't turn around. She set her trunk down in the dust, looked out across that ruined valley, and thought, "I've survived worse than this." She had no idea yet how wrong she was. If you're watching from your city, drop it in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit like, stay until the end, because this one doesn't go where you think it will. The advertisement was 6 lines long. Serena had read it so many times the newsprint had gone soft at the folds, the ink smearing slightly where she'd held it between 2 fingers during the 3-day stagecoach ride from Tucson. She'd memorized it without trying to. Vineyard owner, Darrow Valley, Nevada Territory. Widower, 38 years, seeking capable woman for honest marriage arrangement. Hard work required. Inquire through postal correspondence to G. Vale, Darrow. That was all. No promises. No poetry. No mention of love or companionship or the kind of warm domestic future that other marriage advertisements dangled in front of desperate women like bait on a hook. Just the plain facts, which was exactly why she'd answered it. Serena Holloway was 31 years old and had learned the hard way to be suspicious of men who oversold themselves. Her husband Thomas had been charming. Funny, even. He'd had a way of talking that made everything sound inevitable, like the future was already settled and all she had to do was step into it beside him. She'd believed him, which was her mistake, not his. She knew that now. Thomas hadn't been a cruel man. He'd simply been wrong about almost everything, and then he died of a fever outside of Albuquerque 18 months ago, leaving her with $4, a trunk of practical clothing, and a debt on a rooming house she'd already vacated by the time the creditors came knocking. She wasn't bitter. She'd given herself exactly 2 weeks to be bitter, and then she'd gotten on with the business of surviving. Her father's grape farm outside of Flagstaff had taught her that. Emmett Crane had been a stubborn, weather-beaten man who'd believed that a vineyard was essentially a living argument between the farmer and the land, and that the farmer won by showing up every single day without fail. He'd taught Serena to read vines the way other men read newspapers. The color of the leaves, the angle of new growth, the way a root system talked to the soil above it. She'd spent 16 years learning the language before she'd left to marry Thomas, and forgotten mostly how useful it was. Now it was the only useful thing she had left. The stagecoach had deposited her in the town of Darrow at 2:15 in the afternoon on a Wednesday in the 3rd week of October, 1883. The town was smaller than she'd expected and more sunburned. A main street of 7 or 8 buildings, the tallest of which was a feed store with peeling yellow paint. There was a saloon, a telegraph office, a dry goods store, and a livery stable that smelled of old hay and something she chose not to identify. 2 men on a porch had watched her climb down from the coach with her trunk, and neither of them had offered to help. She found directions to the Vale property from the woman behind the dry goods counter, who had looked at Serena's trunk, then at Serena's face, and then said, with a particular kind of careful neutrality, "You're the one that answered his advertisement, then." "I am," Serena said. Said the woman, which wasn't exactly an answer. The Vale Vineyard was 4 miles east of town, along a road that was more suggestion than fact, a pair of wheel ruts pressed into pale desert scrub that wound between low hills of sandstone and sage. Serena had hired the stagecoach driver's son, a thin boy of about 15 named Denny, to carry her trunk out in a borrowed wagon, and she sat beside him on the bench with her hands folded in her lap and watched the landscape change as they moved east. She smelled the vineyard before she saw it, not the rich, complex smell of healthy vines in late season. She would have recognized that immediately, from childhood. But something else. Something faintly wrong. A dry, papery smell with a sourness underneath it, like fruit that had started to turn before it was ripe. Then the wagon crested a low rise, and she saw the valley was wider than she'd expected. That was her first thought. The actual geography was more generous than the advertisement had suggested. A broad, shallow basin, maybe 3/4 of a mile across, with red rock walls on the northern and eastern sides, and a long slope of open land falling away to the south. There was water here, or there had been. She could see the remains of an irrigation channel running along the eastern edge, its banks partially caved in and clogged with debris. And then there were the vines. Row after row of them, stretching across the valley floor in lines that someone had once laid out with care and intention. At a distance, if you squinted, they almost looked like a working vineyard. But Serena had grown up in vineyards, and she didn't squint. The leaves were wrong, too sparse, too early. It was October, so some leaf drop was expected. But these vines had been losing leaves all summer. She could tell from the dry, brittle way the remaining foliage clung to the cordons. The wood was dark in places where it should have been pale gold, and even from the wagon she could see sections where the trunks had developed a twisted, stressed quality, like something pulling against itself underground. At least a third of the vines in the nearest rows looked dead. "Mr. Vale doesn't get many visitors," Denny said, without particular inflection, as the wagon rolled down into the valley. "I can see why," Serena said quietly. She was already counting rows, estimating acreage, trying to calculate in her head what she was actually looking at. The mathematics were not encouraging. The farmhouse sat near the center of the property on slightly elevated ground. A sensible location. Whoever had chosen it had known something about drainage. It was a plain two-story structure of adobe and timber, with a low porch running along the front and a separate kitchen building connected by a covered walkway. Behind it, she could see a barn, a small equipment shed, and what might have been a bunkhouse, though it had the look of a building that hadn't been used in some time. A man was coming around the corner of the barn as the wagon drew up. Gideon Vale was tall, but not in the way that announced itself. He moved with the kind of economy that tall people develop when they've spent years ducking under door frames and trying not to take up more space than necessary. He was lean, with broad shoulders that carried the particular kind of tension that comes from sustained physical work and sustained worry in roughly equal measure. His hair was dark and needed cutting. His face was the kind of face that didn't give much away. Angular, weathered, with dark eyes that assessed the situation before he'd said a word. He stopped about 10 feet from the wagon and looked at her. Serena looked back at him. "Mrs. Holloway," he said. It wasn't a question. "Mr. Vale," she said, "I can see you have a problem." A pause. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite surprise, but a recalibration of some kind. "Which one?" he said. "The vines," she said, "though I suspect there are others." He studied her for another moment. Then he reached up and helped her down from the wagon without making a production of it. "There are others," he said. He showed her to a room on the second floor of the house that was clean and had a window facing east. The furniture was plain: a bed, a chest of drawers, a small table with a basin and pitcher, but everything was in good repair, and someone had recently swept the floor. She noticed a dried stem of something that might have been lavender on the windowsill, placed there either by habit or by an attempt at welcome that he hadn't known how to make verbally. She chose to believe the latter. They ate supper that first night at a long table in the kitchen building, just the two of them and a middle-aged Mexican woman named Imelda, who cooked and kept the house and regarded Serena with the watchful patience of someone who had seen a number of experiments conducted on this property and was waiting to see how this one turned out. The food was simple: beans, salt pork, cornbread, coffee, strong enough to stand a spoon in, and nobody said much. After supper, Gideon spread a rough map of the property on the table and walked her through what he knew. He spoke plainly, without the kind of defensive hedging that some men used when forced to admit the extent of their difficulties. She appreciated that. The vineyard had been planted by his father, Aldous Vale, in 1869, 14 years ago. The elder Vale had chosen the location for its eastern exposure and its access to an underground water source that fed a natural spring on the property's north edge. In the early years, the operation had been modestly successful. Aldous had produced a rough but serviceable table wine that he'd sold to restaurants and saloons in a territory where the appetite for any wine at all outpaced the supply. Aldous Vale had died in 1879. Gideon, who had been working the property with his father since he was 19, had taken it over. And somewhere in the 4 years since, things had gone seriously wrong. "The drainage changed," he said. He put his finger on the map, on the eastern side of the property. "There was flooding 2 years ago, bad one, came down through the canyon. The channel," he traced the line of the irrigation system she'd seen, "got blocked. I cleared what I could, but I think there's still something wrong underneath. Underneath, Serena said. Serena, the roots. I think the water table shifted. The vines that were doing fine before the flood, they're the ones that are worse now. Serena looked at the map. Did your father keep records? Planting dates, rootstocks, anything like that? He got up and came back with a battered ledger, its cover water-stained and warped. She spent an hour going through it while he cleared the supper dishes, and Imelda moved around the kitchen with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to working around people who weren't paying attention to her. The ledger was incomplete and difficult to read in places, but it told her enough. Aldous Vale had planted primarily a variety of Spanish origin, well-suited to desert conditions but sensitive to root disturbance. The flooding Gideon described would have been devastating for those root systems, not killing the vines outright, which would have been almost easier to manage, but stressing them in ways that played out slowly over seasons, weakening their disease resistance, destabilizing their growth patterns, leaving them vulnerable to the kind of gradual decline that looked like a dozen different problems when it was really one. Your father planted well, she said when she finally closed the ledger. The variety was right for this land. The location was right. The problem isn't what he chose. The problem is what happened to what he chose. Gideon had settled back into his chair across the table. He was watching her with that same careful, assessing quality she'd noticed when she arrived. Can it be fixed? She was quiet for a moment. Through the kitchen window, the desert night had come down completely, and she could hear, very faintly, the dry wind moving through the damaged vines outside. Some of it, she said. The rest, she paused. I need to walk the rows first. I need to see all of it before I tell you anything I'm not sure of. He nodded, like that was the answer he'd expected. First light, he said. I'll take you through. They walked the vineyard at first light the next morning, before the heat built. Gideon had handed her a pair of worn leather gloves without comment and led her to the eastern rows, where the damage was most severe. Up close, it was worse than she'd thought, and she'd thought it was fairly bad. She moved slowly, crouching to examine the base of each vine, pressing her fingers into the soil around the trunk, pulling back loose bark to look at the cambium layer beneath. Gideon walked beside her and didn't say much, which she found she preferred to men who felt the need to explain things she was in the process of figuring out for herself. About 40 feet into the first row, she stopped and pressed her palm flat against the ground. Feel that, she said. He crouched beside her and pressed his own hand to the soil. A moment passed. It's damp, he said. It rained 3 weeks ago. Too damp for 3 weeks, she said. The water isn't draining. It's sitting down there in the root zone, which means the roots have been wet for... She straightened up and calculated. Probably 18 months or more. Long enough. Long enough for what? For the root systems to start to rot from the inside, she said. The vine looks alive above the soil line because it's still trying, but it's fighting from a compromised position. This isn't pest damage. It's not disease exactly. It's drowning, slow drowning. Gideon was quiet for a moment. She watched him process that, the way the information settled into his face, with something that looked more like exhaustion than shock. Like a man who has been waiting for the diagnosis he already suspected. How many rows? He said. She turned and looked down the length of the vineyard, then back at him. I need to walk all of them, but at a guess, she paused, choosing honesty over comfort. At least a third have significant root damage, maybe 40%. He said nothing. He looked out across the vineyard with the expression of a man calculating something he hadn't wanted to calculate. The spring section, she said. She pointed toward the north edge of the property, where the land rose slightly toward the rock wall. Show me that. The spring section was different. The vines here were older, the trunks thicker, more gnarled, with the look of plants that had been carefully managed over many years. And they were alive in a way that the eastern rows were not. The leaf color was better. The wood had that healthy, pale gold quality. And when she crouched and pressed her fingers into the soil near the roots, she felt the difference immediately. Drier, properly drained. A soil structure that was doing what it was supposed to do. These are your father's originals, she said. The first plantings, yes. He said they were the most important. He was right. She stood and looked at the surrounding terrain, working out the slope angles in her head, tracing the natural drainage paths with her eyes. The spring is up there, she pointed. The water runs down and east. In a normal season, it feeds the soil at the right depth. But when you get a big water event, the kind of flooding you described, it overwhelms the eastern side first. She turned back to the spring section. These vines survived because the land itself protects them. The slope is right here. The natural drainage is working. Gideon was watching her. You know a lot about this. My father grew grapes, she said, in Flagstaff. Not so different from here in some ways, more rainfall in some years. He had a flood in 1871 that nearly finished him. She crouched again and ran a finger along one of the old vine's lower canes, checking its flexibility. Good. He saved most of it by fixing the drainage first before he touched the vines. Is that what you're going to tell me? Fix the drainage? She looked up at him. I'm going to tell you a lot of things, Mr. Vale. Some of them you'll like, and some of them you won't. But yes, the drainage is where we have to start. The vines can't recover if their feet are still wet. He was quiet for a moment. Above them, on the rim of the valley's northern wall, a hawk was turning slow circles in the pale morning sky. You talked about this like you're staying, he said. Not accusing, just noting. Serena stood and dusted the red soil from her knees. She looked at him steadily. We made an arrangement, Mr. Vale. I've known since yesterday morning that this is more work than I bargained for. I'm telling you that anyway, which I think should count for something. He held her gaze for a moment. Then something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but the structural possibility of one. It counts, he said. The town of Darrow had an opinion about Gideon Vale's vineyard, and about Gideon Vale, and about the woman who'd arrived on the Wednesday stagecoach with one trunk and the audacity to examine his dead vines like she knew something about them. Serena learned this at the dry goods store on the following Saturday when she went to town to purchase supplies. She hadn't been trying to eavesdrop. She wasn't that kind of woman. She found other people's whispered conversations tedious rather than interesting. But the store was small, and the two women on the far side of the bolt fabric rack had not been whispering especially quietly. Heard she came all the way from Tucson. That's what Denny said. 3 days on the coach. Well, she'll learn. The Vale place has been a lost cause since the flood. Since before that, if you ask me. Gideon's a hard worker, I'll say that. But that land she'll be gone before spring. You watch. Serena selected a bolt of heavy cotton duck and set it on the counter, then added a coil of wire that she needed for the vine training work she'd started. The two women looked at her. She looked back at them with the polite blankness that she'd perfected during her 2 years of careful social navigation after Thomas's death. Morning, she said. Morning, said one of them, warily. She paid for her goods and drove the borrowed wagon back to the vineyard without giving any of it further thought. It was not the first time people had expected her to fail. She had found, over the years, that the most useful response to that particular expectation was the same as her father's response to drought, keep showing up. By the end of the second week, she had walked every row. The full picture was not quite as bad as her initial estimate. 35% of the vines had serious root damage, not 40, but there were additional problems she hadn't seen from the surface. The irrigation channel that fed the eastern rows had a buried section, about 30 yards of clay pipe laid by Aldous Vale years ago that had cracked and collapsed in the flood. Water was seeping out of the break and pooling underground, directly into the worst of the root zones. Nobody had found it because nobody had dug deep enough to look. She found it because she dug. Gideon had come out to help after the first hour, and they'd spent the better part of a day with shovels, working along the suspected line of the old pipe, until she felt the shovel tip break through into a pocket of saturated soil at a depth of about 3 feet and said simply, "There." He looked at the exposed section of cracked clay tile and then at her, and she could see him recalculating something. "How did you know where to dig?" he asked. "The vines," she said. "The damage pattern. It wasn't random. It followed a line." She pointed along the row of worst-affected plants. When damage follows a line like that underground, it usually means something underground is causing it. He looked at the broken pipe for a long moment. Then he set his jaw and reached for the replacement lengths of iron pipe they'd brought out from the barn. "Tell me where to start," he said. And that was the thing about Gideon Vale. Serena was beginning to understand. He argued less than she'd expected, and worked harder than she'd had any reason to hope. He was not a man who needed to be right. He was a man who needed the work to succeed, which was a different and considerably more useful quality. They replaced the broken section over 3 days, excavating carefully, relining the channel with gravel before setting the new pipe to improve the drainage around it. It was filthy, exhausting work, and by the end of each day she was so tired that she fell asleep at the kitchen table twice, which embarrassed her both times and seemed to embarrass Gideon on her behalf, which struck her as oddly considerate. Imelda, for her part, began setting a cup of coffee in front of Serena at the table each morning without being asked, which was the closest thing to an endorsement that Serena suspected was forthcoming. In the evenings, after supper, she worked on figures. She had commandeered one corner of the kitchen table with a ledger of her own, a clean one she'd bought in town, and she spent her evenings filling it with columns of numbers and notes, calculating yields and costs and the projected trajectory of the vineyard's recovery. Gideon occasionally drifted over to look at what she was doing, and she would show him, and he would study it in silence for a while before going back to whatever he was working on. One evening, in the 3rd week, he sat down across from her and looked at the ledger directly. "It's not good," she said, before he could ask. "No," he agreed. "The drainage repair will help the eastern rows, but some of those vines are too far gone. Even if we fix the water problem, the root damage is," she searched for the right word, "permanent in the worst cases. Those vines won't fully recover. They'll survive probably, but their production will be limited. You'll be running them at a loss." He said nothing. He had his hands flat on the table, and he was looking at the column of numbers she'd labeled projected yield. "So what do you do with a vine that's permanently compromised?" he said. "With the ones that won't recover?" She had been waiting for this question. She'd been working up to it, and she'd been honest with herself about the fact that she wasn't sure how he would receive the answer. "You cut your losses," she said. "You take them out." He was very still. "Take them out. The worst sections, the ones that are beyond saving." She turned the ledger so he could see her notes more clearly. "If you keep running them, you're spending money on irrigation and labor for vines that will give you maybe 30% of normal yield, indefinitely. That's not recovery. That's managed decline." She paused. "But if you pull them out and replant what? There are varieties better suited to what this land is now. After the flooding, after the water table shifted, the conditions have changed, and the old Spanish variety isn't the best choice for what you're dealing with anymore." She had been researching this, corresponding with a viticulture professor in California whose name she'd found in an agricultural journal at the Darrow Telegraph office. "There are drought-resistant varieties being developed specifically for desert vineyard conditions. They're expensive to establish. They won't produce for 2-3 years minimum." The silence stretched out. "3 years," he said, "at minimum. Possibly 4 before you see a full harvest." He looked at the ledger. Then he got up and walked to the kitchen window and stood there with his back to her, looking out into the dark. She let him. She had said what needed to be said, and there was nothing to gain by filling the silence. After a long while, he said, "And the spring section? The old vines. They're your strongest asset," she said. "If we protect them and manage them properly, they'll produce well this season. Not enough to make up the difference, but enough to keep operating while the replanting establishes." "Well, I bet everything on a plan that won't pay off for 4 years," he said. Not bitterly. Just naming the shape of it. "Yes," she said. "That's what I'm suggesting. That's what—" He turned from the window. His face was unreadable in the low lamplight, the kind of face that had learned to process difficult information privately over years of doing it alone. "I'll think on it," he said, and he left her to her ledger. She found him at dawn the next morning, already in the vineyard. He was standing at the edge of the eastern rows, the damaged ones, with his arms crossed, and the early light making long shadows through the ruined vines behind him. She came and stood beside him without saying anything. After a while, he said, "My father planted these, some of them." A pause. "Not all of them. Some were here when he bought the land, but the rows he planted himself, he used to walk them every morning, before anything else." She didn't say anything to that. "He used to say a vineyard was a 40-year conversation," Gideon said, "that you couldn't rush it and you couldn't fight it. You just had to learn to listen to what it was telling you." The wind was coming down from the northern canyon wall, carrying the dry smell of sage and something almost cool. In a few hours, it would be just hot and dry, and the work would begin again. "What's it telling you now?" Serena said. He was quiet for a long time. A crow landed in one of the dead vines 3 rows over, considered them both with yellow eyes, and flew away. "That it's not finished," he said. He turned and looked at her. "All right," he said, "let's do it your way." She had expected to feel relief, and she did. But underneath the relief was something else. The weight of what she'd just agreed to, the scope of what she'd just claimed she could do. She was 31 years old, she had $32 and some coins to her name, and she had just persuaded a man she'd known for 3 weeks to bet what remained of his inheritance on her judgment. "Right," she said. "Then we start on the drainage completion today, and I'll write to Sacramento about the rootstock order this week." He nodded. He looked at the dead rose for one more moment. "I'm going to need to trust you," he said. It was not a question. It was not a statement of affection. It was a plain acknowledgement of the reality they were both stepping into, and the vulnerability in it was entirely unsentimental. "I know," she said. "I won't tell you that's not a risk." He almost smiled. The structural possibility of it was there again, just for a moment. "No?" he said. "I didn't figure you would." And then they went to work. Yes. By the end of October, the drainage repairs in the eastern section were substantially complete. The buried pipe had been replaced for its full length, and Serena had supervised the installation of a new gravel drainage bed along the worst of the waterlogged rows, back-breaking work that required Gideon to hire 2 men from town for 4 days, which had cost money they didn't really have, and which both of them had chosen not to discuss too directly. She had also identified what she was calling, in her private ledger, the lost rows. 17 rows in the eastern section where the root damage was too severe and too far advanced to justify preservation. She walked them again, alone, one gray afternoon when Gideon was in town, and confirmed her assessment vine by vine, noting each plant in the ledger with a small mark that she told herself was clinical and tried not to feel anything about. Her father had pulled a rose before. She had helped him. She knew the particular quality of silence that fell over a vineyard section when the decision had been made but the work hadn't started yet, the way a thing could feel like a failure and like the only reasonable choice at the same time. When Gideon came back from town that evening, she showed him the marked ledger. He looked at the list for a long time without speaking. 17 rows, he said. "Yes. That's," he calculated, "a third of the eastern section." "Yes." Closed the ledger and set it on the table. He sat with his hands around his coffee cup and looked at the wall for a while. "Spring," he said finally. "We do it in spring, when the ground is workable." "That's right," she said. "And we order the new rootstock now, so it's ready for planting when the removals are done." He nodded, slowly. "How much?" She had already written the number in the ledger. She turned it toward him and tapped the figure. He looked at it for a long moment, and she watched his jaw tighten and then deliberately relax. A man making a decision and then making peace with the decision at the same time. "Write the letter to Sacramento," he said. Outside, the desert night was coming down across the valley, and the vines, living and dead alike, stood in their rows in the darkness, waiting for whatever came next. Serena picked up her pen. The letter to Sacramento went out on a Tuesday, tucked inside a longer correspondence to the viticulture department at the California Agricultural College that Serena had spent 2 evenings composing. She'd explained the soil conditions, the flood history, the water table shift, and the specific challenges of high desert planting with the kind of precision that came from having walked every foot of the property at least twice. She'd asked about rootstock availability, pricing, and the earliest viable planting window for the Nevada territory. Then she'd sealed the envelope and handed it to Denny to take to the telegraph office, and she'd gone back to work and tried not to think about how long they'd have to wait for a reply, or what the reply might cost them. November arrived and brought with it a cold that surprised her. The desert cold was different from Flagstaff, drier, sharper at night, with a quality of absolute silence that came down after sunset and made the valley feel as remote as the moon. She'd added a second wool blanket to her bed and taken to keeping her boots near the stove overnight so they weren't brutal to pull on at 5 in the morning. The work shifted in November. The urgent repair work on the drainage was mostly done, and what remained was the slower, more patient labor of preparing for what came next. She pruned the surviving eastern vines with deliberate care, removing the dead wood that had accumulated over seasons of stress, cutting back to the strongest remaining cane growth and leaving the vines in a state that looked, to an uninformed eye, even more sparse and damaged than before. She'd made the mistake of letting Gideon see this without explaining it first, and had caught him standing in the row behind her, looking at her work with an expression that she could only describe as controlled alarm. "You're taking a lot off," he said. "I know. That vine there were 3 viable canes on it before you started. And now there's one," she said. "The strongest one. The other 2 were drawing from the same root system and getting less than they needed. This one," she touched the remaining cane, running her thumb along its length. "This one can put everything into recovery instead of splitting the effort 3 ways." He was quiet for a moment. "You're sure?" She looked at him. "Are you asking because you're not sure, or because you're anxious?" A pause. "Both," he admitted. "Then yes," she said. "I'm sure." He went away, and she kept pruning. The truth was that she was mostly sure. There was a difference, she had learned from her father, between certainty and the confidence required to act as though you were certain when someone else's livelihood depended on your judgment. Her father had called it the weight of knowing, meaning the specific gravity of standing in front of a sick vine with a pair of pruning shears in your hand, and understanding that what you did in the next 60 seconds would ripple forward across years. She felt that weight every time she made a cut. She was just careful not to show it. Imelda had opinions. This took Serena a while to understand, because Imelda expressed her opinions the way some women express everything, sideways, through action rather than statement, leaving the conclusion to be drawn by whoever was paying attention. She would set Serena's coffee down with a particular firmness when she'd been working too late. She would place an extra portion of beans on Serena's plate without comment after a day of heavy outdoor work, and she had a way of positioning herself in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed and gaze aimed at nothing in particular, that Serena gradually recognized as the preamble to an indirect conversation. One evening, in mid-November, Imelda positioned herself in the kitchen doorway while Serena was updating her ledger and Gideon was somewhere in the barn, and said to the middle distance, "He hasn't eaten a proper supper at that table since his wife died. 2 years. Serena looked up. "I didn't know he'd been married. Clara, fever, same as gets everyone out here." Imelda's face didn't change much. She was a good woman, not much for land or vines, but she kept him from disappearing into himself, which is what he does when left alone. Serena looked back at her ledger. "He seems to manage well enough." "He manages," Imelda agreed. "Managing is not the same as well enough." She moved back into the kitchen proper. "He's been eating supper at the table every night since you arrived." Serena didn't know what to do with that information, so she wrote it in a corner of her mind alongside other things she was storing for later consideration and said nothing. Gideon Vale's inner life was, she had decided, not her business. Or rather, it was precisely as much her business as he chose to make it, and he had chosen so far to make it very little. He was direct about practical matters. He occasionally said something that surprised her with its dry humor, and he did not talk about himself any more than was absolutely necessary. She respected that, partly because it suited her own preference for not being asked to account for her own grief, which was still present, just quiet, like a bruise in a place she'd learned not to press. Thomas had been dead for 18 months. She had loved him in the way you love someone whose flaws you understand and accept because the good things outweigh them. She had grieved him honestly, and then she had answered an advertisement in a newspaper because the alternative was remaining in a situation with no foundation and no future. And she had never been the kind of woman who stayed in a collapsing place just because leaving felt hard. She was aware that there was a kind of poetry in this, leaving a collapsing marriage behind to arrive at a collapsing vineyard, and she had decided not to examine it too closely. The reply from Sacramento arrived in the last week of November, and it was better than she'd expected and worse than she'd hoped, which was about standard for life. The viticulture professor, a man named Dr. Elias Burr, had written back at length, 3 pages in a tight academic hand, with detailed recommendations on drought-resistant variety selection and a price list for available rootstock that made her breath catch slightly. He had also included a note of professional curiosity about the conditions she'd described that had the quality of a man who found the problem interesting, which she decided to count as a resource. She took the letter to Gideon at the barn, where he was repairing a section of fence, and read the relevant portions aloud while he worked. He asked precise questions. She answered them precisely. They went through the numbers together, standing in the barn doorway, with the cold afternoon light coming in flat and yellow across the territory beyond. The rootstock for the 17 condemned rows would cost more than they had on hand. Not catastrophically more, but more. The spring section will produce this year, she said. Not a full harvest, but if we work them right, manage the canopy carefully, control the water, we should get enough to sell. It won't cover everything, but it narrows the gap. How much of a gap are we talking about? He said. He was looking at the numbers she'd written on the back of an envelope. She told him. He was quiet for a while. The fence post he'd been working on stood at a slight angle, and he reached out and straightened it with one hand, a reflexive correction. I have some savings, not a lot. I know, she said. I've seen the operating account. He looked at her, and for a moment she thought he might object to that, to the implication that she'd been examining his finances without discussion. But he didn't. He'd given her access to the ledgers himself, on her third day at the property, with the matter-of-fact openness of a man who understood that the person trying to save a thing probably needed to know everything about it. We're going to be close, he said. Yes, she said. We are. He handed the envelope back to her. Write to Dr. Burr. Tell him we'll take the first shipment. You see, December was cold in ways that tested the remaining vines and, honestly, tested Serena as well. She was not built for idleness, but there was a particular kind of winter work that required patience rather than labor, monitoring, watching, waiting to see how the pruned vines responded to the cold, checking daily on the section where they'd repaired the drainage to make sure it was holding. She made her morning rounds in the gray pre-dawn quiet and told herself what her father had told her. The vineyard needs you to pay attention. It doesn't always need you to do anything. Gideon, she was learning, had his own version of this. He had a chair at the end of the kitchen table, not the head, but the far end near the window, where he sat some evenings after supper with a cup of coffee and did something that looked like nothing but was probably thinking. She had started to understand the difference between the silences he was comfortable with and the ones that had something behind them, though she wouldn't have said she knew him well enough to interpret the difference reliably. One evening she came in late from her rounds and found him at the table with the old ledger, his father's ledger, open in front of him. He wasn't writing in it, he was just looking at it. She poured herself coffee and sat down at her end of the table and said nothing. After a while he said, My father lost 3 rows of vines in 1872, a blight. He pulled them himself, which it took him the better part of a week because he kept stopping. A pause. I remember watching him from the ridge. I was 8. I didn't understand why it was taking so long. Did you ask him? She said. No, I knew it wasn't the time. He was quiet for a moment. He replanted that spring, better vines than what he'd pulled. He always said the loss made room for something better. I thought that was just something he told himself to feel better about it. Maybe it was both, she said. Something he told himself and also the truth. He looked at her then for a moment. The lamp was low, and his face had that quality it sometimes did of being entirely present and entirely closed off at the same time. You ever lose anything? He said. Not prying, just asking, the way people ask questions in the dark that they wouldn't ask in daylight. My father's farm, she said. After he died, my brother sold it. They needed the money, and I was already married and gone, and I didn't... She paused. I didn't have standing to argue. And then I lost my husband. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. And then I ran out of other things to lose, so I answered your advertisement. He was quiet for a while. That's not... I didn't mean to make you recite all of that. You didn't make me, she said. I chose to. He nodded slowly. He closed his father's ledger and set it aside. For what it's worth, he said, I think Emmett Crane's daughter is probably the only reason this vineyard is still going to exist in 5 years. It was the most direct thing he had said to her in 7 weeks, and she felt the weight of it in a way she hadn't expected. That's not proven yet, she said. No, he agreed, but I'm starting to think it will be. January brought 2 things. A hard frost that tested the pruned vines in ways that Serena monitored with vigilance, going out 3 mornings in a row before dawn to check for frost damage on the exposed wood, and a visitor. His name was Aldridge Pell, and he arrived on a Thursday morning driving a very clean wagon, which told Serena something about him before he'd introduced himself. He was perhaps 50, with the polished look of a man who lived in towns and dealt in paper rather than land. He represented, he explained, a group of buyers from the Elko and Reno territories who were in the habit of assessing Nevada vineyard operations and acquiring those that showed promise. Gideon had been in the eastern rows when Pell arrived, and Serena had been the one to greet him at the house. She'd shown him to the porch and poured water and listened to his pitch, with the expression she reserved for situations where she needed to understand something fully before she decided what to do about it. The offer, when it emerged, was not generous. He was proposing to purchase the property, land, vines, house, equipment, at a price that reflected, he said with the delicacy of someone handling an unpleasant truth, the current condition of the operation. The price was less than half what the property would have been worth before the flooding. The vineyard is under active restoration, she said. The drainage issues have been repaired. The spring section is in good condition and should produce this season. Pell looked at her with the polite patience of a man who had encountered enthusiastic spouses before. Yes, but the eastern section is being replanted with drought-resistant variety with rootstock on order from the California Agricultural College. A small pause. That's a significant capital investment for an operation in this condition. Which is why the operation isn't for sale, she said. He shifted slightly. Perhaps Mr. Vale would like to hear the offer directly. Mr. Vale knows you're here, she said. If he'd wanted to hear it directly, he'd be on this porch. Pell looked at her for a moment with a different quality of attention, something between reassessment and mild irritation. Then he set down his water glass and picked up his hat. The offer stands through February, he said, if circumstances change. Thank you for your time, said Serena. She watched his very clean wagon roll back down the road toward Darrow, and then she went to find Gideon. He was at the far end of the eastern section, checking the drainage beds they'd installed. He looked up when she approached. Well, he said. He made an offer. I told him no. Gideon was very still for a moment. You told him no. Yes. Without... You were 50 yards away, she said. You chose not to come to the porch. That told me what I needed to know about what you wanted. She paused. Was I wrong? He looked at her. Something moved through his face. Not quite amusement, but something adjacent to it. Something that had more warmth in it than she'd seen before. No, he said. You weren't wrong. She nodded. Good. The drainage beds are holding. Come look, Mom. February was quieter, but quieter in the way that a held breath is quiet. The rootstock order had been confirmed. Dr. Burr had written again with shipping details and specific planting guidance that Serena had read carefully enough to annotate in the margins. And the delivery was expected in early March, which meant the removal of the condemned eastern rows had to be completed before then. She had decided not to think of it as destruction. She had decided to think of it as the surgical removal of something that was harming the surrounding tissue, which was a more accurate description anyway. Gideon had hired the same two men from town, a father and son named Garrett and Will Eustace, for the removal work. Garrett was taciturn and competent and had the look of a man who had done hard agricultural work for 30 years and had run out of feelings about it. His son Will was 18 and loud and occasionally said things that were almost funny, and Serena found herself unexpectedly glad of the noise in what had been a very silent operation for months. The removal took 8 days. 8 days of pulling dead and dying vines from the ground, root balls and all, stacking them in the yard to be burned, breaking up the old growing wire in stakes, clearing the soil down to a depth that would allow for fresh planting. The ground gave up the old vines reluctantly, the way ground always gives up things that have been rooted in it for years. On the 6th day, Gideon stopped in the middle of a row and stood with a pulled vine in his hands. One of the original planting rows, she realized, from the thickness and the particular character of the root system. He stood there for a moment that went on slightly too long. She didn't say anything. She kept working. After a while, she heard him set the vine down on the stack and pick up his tools and continue. She glanced back once. His face was set and forward, the jaw doing that deliberate thing it did when he was managing something. She turned back to her own work. Some things needed to happen without comment. Her father had taught her that too. By the end of February, the rows were clear. The soil had been turned and amended with the compost they'd been preparing since November. The stakes and wire were reset to the spacing Dr. Burr had recommended for the new variety. The rows that had been dying for 2 years stood empty and prepared, waiting. Serena stood at the end of one of the cleared rows in the cold, late February light and looked at the prepared soil running away from her, dark and turned and ready, and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not certainty. She'd been careful about certainty, but something close to conviction, the specific belief, not in a guaranteed outcome, but in the rightness of the direction. That what she'd done here, what they'd done, was pointed at something real. The rootstock would arrive in a week. They would plant in March. The spring section would produce its first harvest in her care sometime in late summer or early fall, and the quality of that harvest would tell buyers something important about whether the Vale Vineyard was worth paying attention to. And the new rows would grow, slowly, the way everything worth having grew. Not in a rush, but steadily, putting roots down into the amended soil, learning the land the same way the old vines had learned it, one season at a time. Gideon came up beside her and stood at the end of the row. "Doesn't look like much," he said. "Not yet," she said. He looked down the line of prepared earth, and she watched him take in the scale of what they'd committed to, the irrevocable nature of it. The old vines were gone. There was no going back to what had been there, even if they'd wanted to, which they didn't. "My father used to say the hardest part of farming wasn't the work," he said. "It was the waiting." "He was right," she said. They stood there for another moment in the cold, looking at the cleared rows. Then Gideon turned up his collar against the wind. "I'll get the coffee started," he said. And they walked back toward the house through the pale winter light, leaving the empty rows behind them, waiting for March. The rootstock arrived on a Wednesday in the second week of March, packed in damp burlap and loaded across 2 wagons that Denny drove out from town with the careful slowness of someone transporting something breakable. Serena was in the eastern section when she heard the wagons coming down the road, and she walked out to meet them with her hands already dirty from the morning's soil work. She counted the bundles against Dr. Burr's shipping manifest, while Denny waited with his hands in his pockets. Everything was there. The variety was right. The root systems were healthy. She checked 3 bundles at random, unwrapping the burlap far enough to examine the root mass and the graft union, then wrapping them back carefully. Good nursery work. Someone in Sacramento had known what they were doing. "It all check out?" Denny asked. "Yes," she said. "Help me get them into the shade." They moved the bundles to the north side of the barn, out of the direct sun, and Serena covered them with wet sacking to keep the roots from drying out. Planting needed to start within 48 hours. She'd already prepared the planting holes in the cleared rows, spacing them to Dr. Burr's specifications, and she'd been checking soil temperature for a week. The ground was ready. Gideon came out of the barn and stood looking at the rows of bundled rootstock stacked along the wall, and she could see him doing the same arithmetic she'd done when the Sacramento invoice had arrived, converting the physical reality of those bundles into the dollar figure they represented, which was most of what remained of his savings. "It's all here," she said. "Good," he said. He looked at the bundles for another moment, then turned to her. "Let's plant." They started that afternoon and worked through the following 2 days with a focused intensity that left little room for conversation. Garrett and Will Eustace were back, and Imelda, who turned out to have grown up on a farm outside Sonora and knew more about planting work than she'd previously mentioned, came out on the second afternoon and worked alongside them without being asked. The 4 of them moved down the rows in a practiced rhythm, Gideon setting stakes, Will digging, Garrett positioning the rootstock, Serena setting depth and angle and tamping soil with the specific pressure required to eliminate air pockets without compressing the root zone. It was exacting work. She corrected Will twice on his planting depth, and the second time he looked at her with the expression of a young man who has been corrected once too often, and she said, "I know it seems like inches don't matter. They do. Too shallow, and the graft union is exposed to frost. Too deep, and you bury it and lose the varietal character entirely. The difference is here," she showed him with her hands, "and here." He looked at what she was showing him, and his expression shifted from irritated to genuinely interested, which she'd hoped for. "How do you know all this?" he said. "My father," she said, "and about 15 years of paying attention." She moved on to the next plant. Behind her, she heard Will adjust his technique without being told again. By the end of the second day, all 17 rows were planted. The new vines were in the ground, small, bare root things that looked absurdly insignificant against the scale of the work that had preceded them. Serena stood at the end of the last completed row in the fading afternoon light and felt the particular flatness that followed intense effort, the moment after a thing is done when the adrenaline drops and you're left standing in the ordinary world, tired and uncertain and hoping you got it right. "They look small," Will said somewhere behind her. "They are small," she said. "For now." Spring in Darrow Valley turned out to be a complicated season, which Serena should have anticipated, but hadn't quite. The rains that came in April were welcome. The new plantings needed moisture to establish, but they came harder than expected. 3 days of steady rain that tested the drainage work she and Gideon had done on the eastern section. She was out in the rain on the second day, walking the drainage beds with a lamp, checking for pooling in the root zones, kneeling in mud to feel whether the water was moving through correctly. It mostly was. Mostly. There was one section, near the middle of the third eastern row, where she found standing water in a low spot she hadn't accounted for. She flagged it with a stake and went back to the house soaked through, and the next morning she and Gideon dug a secondary drain by hand that ran to the main channel, which fixed it. But it had been close, and she'd lain awake part of that second night listening to the rain on the roof and running calculations she had no way to verify until the water receded. The new root stock survived the rains. She checked each plant individually when the ground dried enough to work, examining the graft unions for damage, pressing the soil carefully around any plants that had shifted in the water-softened ground. 14 of the 17 rows showed no problems. 2 rows had minor settling issues she corrected with additional soil. One plant in the far eastern corner hadn't taken. She found it on her 4th check. The root mass failed to establish, the plant already going soft at the crown. She pulled it, set a marker, wrote it in the ledger. 1 plant lost. She ordered a replacement from Sacramento. These were not catastrophes. She reminded herself of that regularly. These were the ordinary disappointments of agricultural work, the standard friction of trying to grow things in difficult ground. She knew this. She had watched her father absorb setbacks with the same forward-leaning patience. Not denial, but refusal to let the small failures consume attention that belonged to the larger work. What she hadn't entirely anticipated was how hard it would be to maintain that patience when the financial margin was as thin as theirs was. In late April, Gideon showed her the operating account figures. He did it plainly, without build-up, setting the paper on the table after supper the way he set everything important, directly in front of her. No hedging. The number was not good. After the rootstock purchase, the hiring of the Eustaces, the equipment repairs and supply costs of the winter and spring, what remained was enough to carry them through the summer if nothing went wrong, and marginally into fall if the spring section harvest came in at the yield she was projecting. If it didn't, they would be in serious trouble before the new plantings had been in the ground a full year. She looked at the figure for a long time. "I know," she said. "I'm not telling you to panic," he said. "I know that too. I'm telling you so you have the full picture." She looked up at him. "Gideon, I've had the full picture since November. I've been managing the full picture for 6 months. He held her gaze. "I know, He stopped. He picked up his coffee cup and set it down without drinking from it. "I needed to say it out loud, I think. To someone." She understood that. She'd lived alone with hard numbers long enough to know the specific loneliness of being the only person who had to look at them. "The spring section will produce," she said. "I've been managing those vines carefully all winter. The canopy work is good, the water balance is right. I think we'll get a solid yield." She paused. "I can't promise what the buyers will pay for it. That's the part I can't control." "No," he said. "That's never been the part you could control." They sat for a while in the kitchen quiet. Outside, a coyote called somewhere in the valley, a sound she'd gotten used to, the way you get used to the specific nighttime sounds of a place once you've been there long enough. "My father took on debt twice," Gideon said. "Once when the water pump failed, and once when we had a bad frost year and lost most of the harvest. Both times he paid it back, but I remember what those years were like." He was looking at the table. "I remember what he looked like." "How did he come through it?" she said. "He didn't stop," Gideon said. He just didn't stop. Morning came and he got up and went to work. He finally picked up the coffee and drank. I used to think that was stubbornness. Now I think it was just the only option he could see. It's usually the same thing, she said. He looked at her, and for a moment the distance he kept between himself and the world contracted slightly, the way it sometimes did late at night when they'd both been tired enough for their defenses to get economical. You're very practical, he said. It wasn't a criticism. I've had to be, she said. Did you used to be different? She thought about that honestly. I used to be more, she searched for the word, credulous, about things working out, about people. She set down her own cup. Experience is a particular kind of education. He nodded, slow. Yeah, he said. It is. So, May arrived with heat, and the spring section responded to it the way healthy vines respond to the turn of season, waking up fast, pushing new growth with the focused energy of plants that had been properly cared for through winter. Serena walked the rows every morning and felt something loosen slightly in her chest each time she did. The leaf color was right. The new shoot growth was strong and evenly distributed, which meant the pruning work she'd done had balanced the vine's energy the way she'd intended. She still worried. She had accepted, a person who worried as a baseline condition, who processed anxiety through action rather than through the expression of it, which meant she was frequently doing something in the early hours of the morning that looked like ordinary work, and was partly ordinary work and partly the physical management of fear. Gideon noticed, she thought, though he didn't say anything about it directly. He had a way of appearing in whatever section she was working in around mid-morning, ostensibly to check on something adjacent, and staying long enough to make conversation before drifting away. She had eventually understood that this was his version of asking if she was all right, a check-in conducted through proximity rather than inquiry. She found she didn't mind. The trouble, when it came from a direction she hadn't entirely prepared for. At the end of May, a man named Curtis Webb arrived at the property. Webb ran a wine brokerage out of Elko that supplied to restaurants and hotels across northern Nevada. And he was, as far as Serena could determine, one of the 3 significant buyers in the territory that a small operation like the Vale Vineyard could realistically sell to. He'd bought from Aldous Vale in the Vineyard's early years, according to the old ledger, though that relationship had apparently deteriorated sometime before Gideon took over. He was a wide man, not tall, with the florid confidence of someone accustomed to being the most commercially significant person in most rooms he entered. He looked at the spring section with the eyes of someone calculating, and he looked at the replanted eastern rows with something that was almost contempt, not quite overt enough to be rude, but present. "These new plantings," he said. "What variety?" Serena told him. He nodded without enthusiasm. "Won't produce for what? 3 years?" 2.5 minimum, she said. "Full production in 3 to 4. He walked along the edge of the eastern section, looking at the small new vines with their modest spring growth. That's a long time for an operation of this size to be carrying non-producing rows. "It is," she agreed. "And the spring section? Those are the old Aldous plantings?" "Yes, they're in good condition. The harvest this fall should be solid." He looked at the spring section for a while, his hands behind his back. "I bought from Aldous. Good enough wine. Nothing remarkable." He turned back to her. "Gideon's production the last few years has been inconsistent." "There were drainage problems that affected vine health," she said. "They've been identified and corrected." "So you say." He was looking at her with the particular attention of a man trying to figure out what category to put her in. "You've been here since fall?" "Yes." "And you have a background in viticulture?" "My father's vineyard. 16 years of direct experience." She kept her voice level. "I'm happy to walk you through the spring section in detail, Mr. Webb, if you'd like to see the vine management work firsthand." He considered this. "Maybe," he said, "but I want to talk to Mr. Vale." Gideon was in the barn. He came out when Imelda sent Will Eustace to find him. They'd kept the Eustaces on through spring, stretching the budget further than was comfortable because the work genuinely required the labor. And he shook Webb's hand with the careful courtesy of a man who had a complicated history with this particular visitor. She watched them talk. Webb made his position clear within about 10 minutes, with the directness of a man who charged for his time and saw no reason not to front-load the uncomfortable truth. He was skeptical. The Vale operation had been unreliable for 3 years. The replanting plan was ambitious but unproven. He was not in the habit of committing to purchase agreements with operations whose recovery was theoretical. "This season's harvest," Gideon said, cutting through it. "What would it take for you to commit to buying this season's harvest at a fair price?" Webb looked at him for a moment. "I'd need to see the yield. Come harvest, I'll come out and inspect. If the quality is what your wife says it should be, we can talk price." He paused. "I'm not making any commitments before I see the fruit." Gideon looked at Serena. She gave him a small nod. This was not a victory, but it was not a closed door. And a not closed door was what they needed right now. "That's fair," Gideon said. Webb left mid-afternoon. They stood on the porch and watched him go, and Serena was aware of the specific quality of the silence that followed, the kind that follows a conversation where less was agreed to than you'd hoped. "He'll wait until harvest and then lowball us," Gideon said. "Probably," she said, "which is why we need to find out who else is buying in this territory before fall." He looked at her. "You have someone in mind?" Dr. Burr mentioned a buyer in Reno who's been looking for Nevada Territory products specifically, someone building a regional wine program for a hotel group. She'd been thinking about this since Webb had driven up that morning. "I'll write to Dr. Burr this week." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "You think Webb knows about this buyer?" "I think Webb knows everything that moves in this territory," she said, "which is why he showed up here before harvest instead of after. He wants to establish himself as our only option before we find out we have others." Gideon looked out at the vineyard. The healthy spring section with its good new growth, the replanted eastern rows with their small promising vines, the whole complicated, costly, uncertain enterprise they'd staked everything on. "My father dealt with Webb," he said. "He never liked him." "Smart man, your father." He almost smiled. "Don't let that go to your head." June was the month that nearly broke them, and it didn't announce itself. It started with the water pump. The pump that fed the spring section irrigation had been working since before Aldous Vale built the house, a deep-bored system that drew from the underground source in the valley's north edge. It was old equipment, maintained through years of incremental repair, and Serena had looked at it in November and thought it would hold through the season and noted the thought in her private ledger and then moved on to the dozen more urgent things. In the second week of June, it failed, not gradually. It just stopped. One morning, between her 6 o'clock check and the 8 o'clock watering cycle, as simply and finally as a thing that has been waiting for its moment to give up. Gideon found it when he went to start the pump cycle, and nothing happened. He came to find her in the spring section, where she was checking vine spacing, and said, "Pumps out," with the particular flatness of a man delivering news he's been dreading. She went with him to look. She knew enough about pump mechanisms to diagnose the failure within 20 minutes, and the diagnosis was not good. The main drive shaft had sheared, which was not a field repair. It required a machinist, replacement parts, and time. She estimated 4 to 6 days minimum to get the parts from Elko and complete the repair. In June, in a desert vineyard, 4 to 6 days without irrigation to a section of vines in active growth could be damaging. Could be. The spring section was well established, the roots deep. The soil retained some moisture from the May rains. It might be fine. It might not. She spent the rest of that morning rigging a hand-carry water system, buckets from the spring, carried by hand down the rows to the most vulnerable vine sections, the ones with the youngest growth and the most exposed root zones. It was inefficient and brutal in the June heat, and by noon she was sweating through her work clothes and her back was beginning to protest the bucket weight in ways she tried to ignore. Gideon worked beside her without complaint. Will Eustace showed up mid-morning. Word had reached town through some channels Serena didn't track, and took over the heaviest bucket work without being asked, which she was grateful for in a way she didn't take the time to express. On the second day, she made a decision she'd been turning over since the pump failed. "I need to go to Elko," she told Gideon at supper. "The parts need to be ordered in person. The telegraph takes too long, and I'm not confident the right specifications will be communicated correctly through Denny." She paused. "I also want to speak to someone there about the Reno buyer, Dr. Burr's contact." He looked at her across the table. "That's 2 days' travel." "I know." The vines, Will and Garrett can handle the hand carry for 2 more days. I'll leave detailed instructions. He was quiet for a moment, working through it. You're sure this buyer is worth the trip? I think Webb is going to offer us something insulting in September, and hope we're desperate enough to take it, she said. I want to have somewhere else to stand before that conversation happens. He looked at his food. Then he said, I'll go. You stay with the vines. She opened her mouth to object, and he said without looking up, I know the machinist in Elko. I've done business with him before. And I can make contact with this buyer. He paused. You know the vines better than I do. That's just true. You should be here. She closed her mouth. He was right, and they both knew it, and arguing would have been pride rather than practicality. I'll write you a description of the parts needed, she said. Exact specifications. Don't let him substitute anything. I won't. And the buyer? His name is Hartwell, according to Dr. Burr. Robert Hartwell. He's building a wine program for the Continental Hotel Group in Reno. He wants regional product, Nevada Territory origin specifically, something with a story. She met Gideon's eyes. This vineyard has a story. It just needs someone to tell it. Gideon left the next morning before dawn. She watched his wagon roll out of the valley in the gray, pre-dawn quiet and then turned back to the rows and picked up a bucket. The 4 days he was gone were among the longest she'd spent since arriving in Darrow. Not because she was worried about him, exactly, though she was in the background, in the way you worry about a person who has become important to the functioning of your daily life. It was more that his absence clarified something she'd been not quite looking at for several months. The degree to which the enterprise had become genuinely shared, not in the transactional sense of the arrangement they'd entered, but in the real sense of 2 people whose fates were bound to the same outcome. She watered vines. She checked the new eastern plantings twice daily, examining the summer growth with the close attention of someone watching for early signs of stress. She wrote in her ledger. She ate supper with Imelda, who told her once, in the particular sideways fashion she used for things that mattered, he'll be back before the vines notice he's gone. Serena looked at her. I know, she said. Imelda looked back at her with the expression of a woman who knew several things that she had decided not to say directly, which was probably wise. Gideon came back on the 5th day, late afternoon. The wagon raised dust on the valley road, and she saw it from the spring section and felt something she chose not to examine too closely release in her chest. He came to find her in the rows. He looked tired from the road and something else, keyed up in the way of a person who has news they've been holding through a long drive. Parts are coming, he said. 4 days. Good, she said. And Hartwell? He looked at her. And then, for the first time since she'd known him, Gideon Vale smiled. Not the structural possibility of one. An actual smile, tired and real and complicated. He wants to come see the vineyard, he said. In September, before harvest. She stood in the row with dirt on her hands and the summer heat pressing down on the valley and felt the weight of the past 8 months. The pruning and the digging and the planting and the pump failure and the hand carry water and Webb's skepticism and the numbers in the ledger that had never been comfortable felt all of it shift on its axis, not disappear, not resolve, but shift. September, she said. He said if the quality is what I described, he'd want to talk about a multi-season arrangement. She was quiet for a moment. Around them, the spring section vines stood in their good summer growth, the leaves catching the late afternoon light, healthy and present and alive in ways they hadn't been when she'd first walked these rows in October. Then we'd better make sure the harvest is worth describing, she said. He was still smiling, just barely. That's all you've got? What do you want me to say? I drove 4 days, he said. I talked to a stranger for 2 hours about dirt and drainage and the particular character of desert-grown fruit, most of which I had to recall from things you've told me over the past 8 months. He paused. A small acknowledgement might be appropriate. She looked at him. She was aware of the warmth in the air between them, the specific quality of it, which was different from what it had been in October and November and even February. Not dramatic, just different. The way things between people change when they've been through something hard together and come out the other side still standing. You did well, she said. Thank you, he said, dry. Don't let it go to your head, she said. And she went back to checking vines, and she heard him laugh behind her, a short, real sound, surprised out of him. And the valley held them both in the long summer light, and the work continued. The pump parts arrived on a Tuesday, 4 days after Gideon got back from Elko, exactly as the machinist had promised. Serena supervised the repair herself, not because she doubted the 2 men Gideon had hired to do the installation, but because she needed to see it working with her own eyes before she could stop carrying the low-grade anxiety that had been running underneath everything since the morning it failed. When the pump turned over and water moved through the system and came out the other end of the irrigation line at the correct pressure, she stood there for a moment with her hand on the pipe, feeling the vibration of it, and let out a breath she'd been holding for the better part of a week. "Good?" Gideon said from behind her. "Good," she said. They didn't make more of it than that. There wasn't time. July in the valley was relentless. The heat came down from the rock walls in waves that built through the afternoon and didn't fully release until well after dark. And the work of managing the spring section through peak summer required a level of daily vigilance that left little room for anything else. Serena adjusted the irrigation timing twice as the temperatures climbed, shifting the water cycles to early morning and late evening to reduce evaporation loss. And she walked the rows at midday. Not because there was anything she could do about the heat, but because she needed to see how the vines were carrying it. They were carrying it well. Better than she'd let herself hope, actually. The canopy management work she'd done through spring was paying off in exactly the way she'd intended. The leaves were positioned to shade the developing fruit clusters without blocking the airflow that prevented fungal problems, and the vine's energy was going where she'd directed it, into the fruit, which was sizing up at a rate that made her update her yield projections twice in July, both times upward. She didn't tell Gideon about the updated projections right away. She'd learned over the months that sharing preliminary good news too early created a kind of false accounting. It raised expectations that then had to be managed, and if anything went wrong between projection and reality, the disappointment hit harder than if the news had been delivered once, at the right moment, with the evidence in hand. Her father had been the same way. He'd never told anyone a harvest was going to be good until the fruit was off the vines and in the pressing room, because the vineyard could always find a way to surprise you in the last 100 yards. Gideon had noticed the yield ledger on the kitchen table one evening in late July and picked it up and looked at the numbers without asking permission, which she'd granted him implicitly by leaving it there. He set it down without saying anything, but she caught the expression that crossed his face before he smoothed it out. Something careful and unguarded, the look of a man who wants very much to believe something and is afraid to. She understood that feeling. She lived in it constantly. "Don't get ahead of it," she said. "I'm not," he said. "You are. I can see it." He looked at her. "Is that a problem?" She considered. "Not if you can put it down again when you need to." He thought about that. "Can you? Put it down?" "I have to," she said. "I'm the one who has to make the decisions." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "That sounds lonely." It was such a direct thing to say that it stopped her. She stood at the kitchen table with her hand on the ledger and looked at him, and for a moment the careful management of her own emotional inventory slipped just enough to let something true through. "Sometimes," she said. He nodded slowly. He didn't offer anything comforting or reductive. He just accepted it, the way he accepted most things she told him, directly, without trying to fix what wasn't his to fix. It was, she thought, one of the better qualities she'd encountered in another person. Plus, August was about the fruit. She could feel the harvest coming the way her father had told her you learned to feel it. Not by looking at a calendar, but by paying attention to the whole system at once. The way the leaves started to yellow at the margins. The way the fruit clusters hung differently as the sugar content rose. The way the entire vineyard seemed to slow its growth and redirect its energy inward, concentrating. She was tasting fruit from the spring section twice a week by mid-August, going down the rows with a small knife and cutting single berries from different clusters throughout the section, tasting for sugar balance and acid structure and the particular quality she thought of as readiness, something her father had called the moment when the fruit stops trying and starts being. It was subjective, and she knew it was subjective, and she tracked it alongside the objective measurements she was making on sugar content, which she tested with a small refractometer she'd ordered from Sacramento in May. The numbers were good. The taste was better than the numbers. She told Gideon on a Sunday evening after supper when Imelda had gone to her room and the kitchen was quiet. She set the ledger open to her August yield and quality projections and put her finger on the row labeled Estimated Harvest Date. Second week of September, she said. Maybe the third week if we get a cooling spell, which would actually be better. More time on the vine usually means more complexity in the fruit, but second week is my working target. He looked at the date. Hartwell is coming September 14th. I know. She had planned it that way. I want him to see the fruit on the vine before we pick. He needs to understand what he's looking at before it becomes wine. Gideon looked at her. You've been planning this since June. Since July, she said. June, I was still worried about the pump. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and she could see him processing the full shape of what the next 6 weeks represented. All of it, the months of work and cost and uncertainty, converging on a 2-week window in September when a man from Reno would come to the valley and decide, based on what he found, whether the Vale Vineyard was worth his investment. What happens if he doesn't like what he sees? Gideon said. Then we deal with Webb, she said, which will be less than we need, but more than nothing. And if Webb's offer is as bad as we think it'll be? She was quiet for a moment. Then we find a way to carry the operation through to next season on the spring section's revenue, plus whatever Webb pays, and we try again. She paused. It won't be comfortable. No, he said. It won't. He looked at the table. But we'd make it? She met his eyes. Yes, she said. We'd make it. He nodded, once. It was the kind of nod that meant more than agreement. It meant he was choosing to trust the answer, which was a different and more costly thing. Curtis Webb arrived on September 8th, 6 days before Hartwell, which Serena suspected was not a coincidence. News traveled in a territory this size through channels she couldn't always track, and Webb had proven himself a man who paid attention to his commercial landscape. He arrived with more warmth than he'd shown in May, which made her more cautious rather than less. He shook Gideon's hand with both of his and complimented the property, and he walked the spring section with the air of a man revising his assessment upward and wanting credit for the revision. This is better than I expected, he said, looking at the fruit clusters hanging heavy and dark in the September light. Yes, said Serena pleasantly. He tasted fruit in 3 sections of the vineyard, which was more than she'd expected him to bother with. He had a good palate. She could see it in the way he held the berry on his tongue for a moment before swallowing, the slight pause of a man taking information. She gave him the refractometer reading for the section they were standing in, and he looked at the number and nodded. When are you picking? He said. Second week, she said, depending on weather. He looked at a cluster nearest him, turning it gently in his hand. I'd like to make an offer on the harvest, he said, provided the rest of the section reads like this section. What kind of offer? Gideon said. Webb named a price per ton that was, as Serena had predicted, insulting. Not so low as to be laughable. He was too smart for that. But low enough that accepting it would leave them short of what they needed to carry through winter into next season's operations with any comfort. She kept her face entirely still. That's a starting point, Gideon said. It's a fair offer given the operation's recent history, Webb said. The recent history has been corrected, Serena said. The drainage problems are resolved. The spring section is in the best condition it's been in 5 years, by the evidence of what you've just tasted. She kept her voice level and professional. Our ask is 15% above what you've offered. Webb looked at her. He was recalibrating her again, the same way he had in May, but with different information this time. 12%, he said. 14, she said, and a commitment on next season's harvest at a price to be negotiated in January, based on this year's quality. A pause. Webb looked at Gideon. Gideon looked back at him with the complete blankness of a man who had decided to let his wife conduct this negotiation and was committed to that decision without reservation. Webb looked back at Serena. 13% above my offer, he said, and I'll come back to the table in January about next season. No commitment tonight. She let a beat of silence pass. Agreed, she said. They shook hands. Webb stayed for supper. Imelda had apparently anticipated this possibility and produced a meal considerably more elaborate than the household standard. And the conversation was cordial and careful, the way conversations are between people who have just finished a negotiation and are assessing the distance between what was agreed and what each side had wanted. After Webb left, Imelda cleared the table and went to her room without a word, which was her version of diplomatic withdrawal. Serena sat at her end of the table with her ledger and ran the numbers from the agreed price against their winter operating requirements, and the result was workable, genuinely workable, not in the way that required optimistic assumptions, but in the straightforward accounting sense of income exceeding necessary expenses with a margin that was narrow but real. She set the pencil down. Gideon was watching her from across the table. 13%, he said. I wanted 14, she said, but 13 gets us through winter with a small reserve. You knew what number you needed before he walked in. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. How long have you been doing that? Knowing what number I need? She considered. Since I was about 19, I think. My father made me manage the farm accounts for a season when I was that age. I argued with him about it at the time. She looked at the ledger. He was right. Gideon leaned back in his chair. He had the look of a man who was putting something together slowly, some picture of who she was that was filling in details he'd been collecting over months. He sounds like he was a smart man, he said. He was, she said, and a difficult one, and very good at what he did. She closed the ledger. The useful qualities and the difficult ones were usually the same quality. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then, with a directness that was characteristic of him at his most unguarded, he said, Is that true of you? She looked at him across the table. The lamp was low, the same way it had been that night in February when he'd asked if she'd ever lost anything. The kitchen had a different quality now than it had in those early months. Not warmer exactly, but more inhabited, more settled, as if the room itself had adjusted to containing them both. Probably, she said. I don't always know which qualities are which from the inside. He nodded, like that was an honest answer, which it was. Robert Hartwell arrived on September 14th, as promised, in a good wagon driven by a hired man, with the punctual, organized quality of someone who treated his business trips like appointments. He was perhaps 45, spare and precise, with wire-rimmed glasses and the careful attention of a man who had learned to evaluate things quickly and accurately. He shook hands with both of them on the porch, and Serena noticed that he shook hers first, which she filed away as information about the kind of man he was. She took him through the spring section systematically, moving from the oldest planting blocks near the property's north edge outward through the sections she'd worked hardest on through the year. She talked about the drainage repair, the pruning decisions, the summer canopy management, without overselling any of it. She presented it the way she'd learned to present difficult information, straight and evidenced, letting the facts carry the weight rather than her enthusiasm. Hartwell tasted fruit in 7 different locations through the section, more than Webb had. He asked precise questions. Variety history, soil composition, water source specifics, the refractometer readings she'd been tracking since August. She answered everything directly, and when he asked something she wasn't certain about, she said so and gave him the range of her uncertainty rather than rounding up to confidence she didn't have. At one point, he stopped in a middle row and crouched beside a vine and examined the cordon structure and the placement of the current season's growth. He was quiet for a moment. This pruning, he said, this is careful work. Yes, she said. It took most of November and December. Did you do it yourself? Mostly. Gideon helped in the sections I was moving fastest through. Hartwell stood up. He looked at her with the direct appraisal she'd noticed earlier. You were trained in this specifically? My father's vineyard in Flagstaff. 16 years. He nodded. He looked down the row, then back at her. The eastern plantings. Come look, she said. She walked him through the replanted eastern section with the same straightforwardness, not hiding the youth of the plants or the timeline before they'd produce, but showing him the root stock quality, the establishment progress, the drainage infrastructure that had been laid to support them. She showed him the drainage beds and explained the flood history and what had caused the original vine failures and how the repairs had been executed. Hartwell walked the eastern rows slowly, pausing at intervals, looking at the young vines with an expression she couldn't quite read. When did you arrive at this property? He said. October of last year, she said. He looked at her. You've done all of this in under a year. It wasn't a question, but she answered it. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, The man I spoke with in Elko, Gideon, he told me about the plan for the replanting,
The commitment to tearing out producing rows to put in better stock. He paused. He said it was your assessment and your recommendation. It was, she said. He agreed to it.
Yes, he also said.
Hartwell stopped and looked at the eastern rows for a moment. He said this vineyard was going to be worth something in 5 years that it had no chance of being worth if they'd done nothing. He believed it. He turned back to her. The conviction was his, the analysis was yours. She wasn't sure what to say to that, so she said nothing.
That's an unusual combination, Hartwell said. In my experience, the person with the vision and the person willing to trust it are rarely the same household. Gideon had come up behind them while Hartwell was speaking. Serena heard him stop a few yards back, just close enough to have caught the last of it. She didn't look back. We had the same objective, she said. That helps. Hartwell nodded. He looked at the vineyard one more time. The spring section with its heavy fruit, the young eastern plantings with their first season's growth, the infrastructure of pipe and drainage bed, and careful stake and wire that ran through it all. Then he took off his glasses and cleaned them with the deliberateness of a man who uses the action to organize his thoughts. I'd like to purchase this year's harvest, he said, the full spring section yield, at a price I think will be better than whatever Webb offered you. He named a number. It was 22% above what Webb had agreed to pay. Serena kept her face entirely still, and the only indication of what she felt was that she was very careful for a moment about her breathing. That's for this season, Hartwell said. I'd also like to discuss a 3-season arrangement for the coming years, with pricing tied to quality assessments at harvest. Subject to this year's harvest meeting the standard of what I've tasted today. He looked at her. I believe it will. Gideon came up beside her. She glanced at him. His face was doing the thing it had done in July when he'd looked at the yield projections. That careful, unguarded quality, the look of a man trying to hold something precious without crushing it. We'd want the arrangement in writing, she said, with specific quality benchmarks clearly defined. Of course, Hartwell said, and the eastern replanting. When those vines come into production, we'd want the arrangement to have an option to include that yield as well, at terms to be negotiated when the time comes. Hartwell looked at her. You're thinking 3 years ahead. Someone has to, she said. He almost smiled. All right, he said. I'll have my attorney draw up the initial terms. You should have your own attorney review them. They didn't have an attorney. She'd find one. Of course, she said. The harvest began on September 17th, 3 days after Hartwell's visit, when Serena's twice-daily tastings told her the fruit had arrived at exactly the balance she'd been working toward. They picked over 4 days, a crew of 8 that included the Eustaces, and 4 additional men hired from town, moving through the spring section in an organized sweep that she managed from row to row, directing the pace, checking cluster selection, making sure the fruit was handled with the care that the quality deserved. It was hard, hot, physical work, and it was the best 4 days she'd had since she'd arrived in Darrow. On the 3rd day of picking, she was working through the oldest block, Aldous Vale's original planting, the vines her father-in-law had put in the ground in 1869, the ones that had been her strongest asset and her most careful responsibility all year, and she felt it. The same feeling her father had described, the moment when the work and the outcome aligned, when you could see clearly that the decisions had been right, not because everything had gone perfectly, because it absolutely had not, but because the thing was alive in your hands and it was good. She cut a cluster, turned it in the light. The fruit was dark and full, the skins just yielding to pressure, the smell of it sharp and layered and right. Gideon was 2 rows over. She could hear him working, the snip of shears and the soft sound of clusters dropped into the picking basket. Gideon, she said. Yeah. Come taste this. He came through the row and she held out the cluster. He took a berry and put it in his mouth and was quiet for a moment. Well, he said. Yes, she said. He looked at the cluster, then at the rows around them, then at her. His expression was not triumphant. It was something quieter and more durable than that, something that had to do with survival confirmed rather than victory claimed. My father would have liked this, he said. She looked at him steadily. I think he did like it, she said. He planted it. Gideon was quiet for a moment, and something moved through his face that she chose not to try to name. Then he handed the cluster back and picked up his shears. "We should keep moving," he said. "We're behind on this block." "We are," she agreed, and she turned back to the vines and kept working, and the valley held the heat of the afternoon around them, and the fruit came off the vine heavy and real and full of everything the year had cost them. By the end of the fourth day, the spring section harvest was in. The yield numbers came in slightly above her highest projection, which she hadn't told Gideon had been a possibility, and which she recorded in the ledger that evening with a steadiness that was partly discipline and partly the simple exhaustion of a woman who had been working without a real break since October of the previous year. She wrote the final number and set the pencil down and sat in the kitchen with the ledger open in front of her. Imelda put a cup of coffee at her elbow without a word. Gideon came in from the barn and washed his hands at the basin and sat down across from her and looked at the final number in the ledger. He was quiet for a long time. "We made it," he said. Finally. Like a man who hadn't been willing to say the words until the evidence was in front of him in ink. "This season," she said. "Yes." He looked at her. "You always do that." "What?" "Add the qualification." "Because it's true," she said. "This season is done. Next season starts in," she calculated, "about 6 weeks when we begin the winter pruning on the spring section and do the first growth assessments on the eastern plantings." He looked at her for a long moment. In the lamplight, his face had the settled quality it sometimes had at the end of hard days, the lines of it less guarded than usual, more simply tired. "Serena," he said. "What?" "Can we have one evening," he said, "where we don't plan the next thing?" She looked at him. She looked at the ledger. She closed it. "Yes," she said. "All right." Imelda appeared in the kitchen doorway, took in the closed ledger and the two of them sitting across from each other in the lamplight, and set a bottle on the table between them. A bottle from Aldous Vale's oldest stored wine, dusty and dark, that had been sitting in the cellar since before either of them had laid claim to this piece of ground. She disappeared back into the kitchen without comment. Gideon looked at the bottle. Then he got up and found 2 glasses, and he poured, and he sat back down, and he held up his glass. "To the vines," he said. It was the simplest toast she'd ever heard, and the most accurate. "To the vines," she said. And they drank, in the quiet of the kitchen, while outside the valley settled into the September dark, and the harvested rows stood empty and resting, waiting, the same way they always waited, for whatever came next. The contract from Hartwell's attorney arrived in the first week of October, 12 pages of legal language that Serena read 3 times at the kitchen table before she was satisfied she understood every clause. She had found an attorney in Elko, a woman named Margaret Voss, who had the sharp, economical manner of someone who had spent 20 years being underestimated and had stopped being patient about it. And she had sent the contract to Voss by express post with a letter outlining her specific concerns. Voss wrote back in 10 days with annotations in the margins and 2 clauses she recommended revising. Serena read the annotations, agreed with both, and wrote back with proposed revisions that Voss forwarded to Hartwell's attorney. The negotiation took another week. In the end, the contract came back with one of the 2 revisions accepted in full and the other accepted in modified form, which Voss said in her final letter was a reasonable outcome and that she should sign it. Serena signed it. She set the signed contract on the table in front of Gideon that evening and watched him read it. He read slowly, which she'd learned was not because he was slow, but because he read the way he did everything, thoroughly, without skipping to the conclusion before he'd understood the path to it. When he finished, he set it down. He looked at the signature line, at her name and his name side by side above the date. 3 seasons, he said. With the option to extend, she said, and the eastern planting yield when they come into production, subject to a quality assessment, we negotiate separately. He nodded. He was quiet for a moment, in the way that meant he was feeling something he hadn't decided how to express yet. My father tried to get a multi-season contract with Webb for 8 years, he said. Webb always said the operation wasn't stable enough. She didn't say anything to that. He would have... Gideon stopped. He folded the contract along its original crease and set it on the table. He would have been very glad to see this. I know, she said. He looked at her. How do you know? You never met him. Because you are, she said, and you're like him. He was quiet again for a moment.
Outside, October had come back to the valley, the same dry, cool quality it had when she'd arrived here a year ago, the light going golden and flat across the desert in the late afternoon. She had been here 1 year. The thought had a strange weight to it, the specific gravity of realized time. "What do we do now?" he said. It was an odd question, coming from a man who always knew what to do next. She looked at him more carefully. "About the vineyard?" she said. "About—" He paused. He picked up the contract and set it down again without opening it, a small gesture that had nothing to do with the document. "We made an arrangement. You came here because you needed somewhere to go, and I needed help. That was the arrangement." She looked at him steadily. "Yes. The vineyard is stable now," he said, "or more stable than it's been. The contract is signed. The eastern plantings are established." He was looking at the table. "You've done what you came to do." She understood what he was saying, and she understood what he was not saying, which was more important. She had been aware, in a quiet and unexamined way, that this question was approaching, that the completion of the primary work would eventually surface the secondary one, the one that had been present since October of last year in some form, changing shape as they had changed, accumulating evidence she'd been filing carefully in the part of her mind she'd reserved for things not yet ready for direct examination. "Gideon," she said. "I'm not asking you to leave," he said quickly. "That's not what I'm—" "I know," she said. "Let me finish." He closed his mouth. "I came here because I had nowhere to go," she said. That was true. And the arrangement was practical, which was also true. She looked at her hands on the table. "But I've stayed here because I chose to. Every morning for a year, I've gotten up and worked this vineyard because I wanted to, not because I had no other option." She looked up at him. "That changed somewhere. I'm not sure exactly when." He was very still. "I think it was February," she said, "when you told me about your father walking the rows. I think that was when I understood that this place meant something to me beyond the work." The kitchen was quiet. Imelda was in her room. The desert night had come down fully outside the window, and the valley was that specific dark that has no ambient light in it at all, just stars. "That's a long time to not say anything," Gideon said. "You didn't say anything either," she pointed out. "No," he admitted. "I didn't know how." "Neither did I." She paused. "I'm not sure I know how now, but I'm saying it." He looked at her for a long moment, the way he sometimes did when he was taking in information he didn't want to get wrong. Then he reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not dramatically, not with the performed certainty of a man who had rehearsed this, just set his hand over hers the way you do when you want someone to know you're present, and left it there. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. Outside, the valley was dark and quiet, and the vines stood in their rows in the October cold, resting from the harvest, and nothing about the moment was extraordinary except that it was entirely true. Winter came in properly that year, which was not something Serena had fully prepared for in her first season, but was ready for now. She knew the rhythm of this valley in cold, the way the frost moved down from the northern canyon wall in the mornings, the way the soil held and released heat, the specific character of Darrow Valley winters, which were not brutal but were serious and required attention. She began the winter pruning on the spring section in the 3rd week of October, working through the rows with the particular care she gave the old Aldous Vale plantings, the vines she'd been managing the longest, the ones whose growth patterns she understood now the way she understood the layout of the house, instinctively, without having to think about it. The eastern plantings were showing first-year establishment growth that she was quietly pleased with. Pleased, not satisfied. Satisfaction required a full second season, at minimum, and she was not in the habit of counting things that hadn't fully occurred. But the root systems were working. The grafts had taken uniformly. The young vines were developing the structure she'd designed toward, and when she walked those rows in the early morning quiet, she could see in them the beginning of what they would eventually be. That was the particular discipline of vineyard work she was coming to understand in a way that went beyond what her father had taught her. Not just patience, but the capacity to hold in your mind simultaneously what a thing was and what it was going to become, and to make decisions accordingly. To prune for the vine you couldn't see yet, to invest in a future that had no guarantee attached to it. Her father had called it the long view. She thought it was more personal than that.
She thought it was something closer to faith in the biological fact that living things, given the right conditions, would become what they were meant to be. Not inevitably, not without help, but with enough care and enough time and enough willingness to do the unglamorous work of conditions making, the thing would grow. She pruned in the mornings and updated the ledgers in the evenings, and fell asleep most nights with the particular physical tiredness that had become, over the past year, the condition she associated with rightness. Imelda gave notice in November. She did it the way she did everything, directly, without drama, at supper on a Tuesday. She had a sister in Santa Fe, she explained, who was unwell and needed help. She had been here 11 years since before Clara Vale had died, and she had stayed longer than she'd intended because circumstances had required it, and she was not the kind of person who left when things were difficult. But the circumstances were different now, and she would be leaving before Christmas. Serena looked at her across the table and felt the particular acknowledgement of someone naming what both of them already knew, that Imelda had stayed through the worst of it and was now choosing to leave from a position of things being all right, which was a kind of gift in its own way. "Your sister is lucky to have you," Serena said. Imelda looked at her with the expression she reserved for things that didn't require a verbal response. Gideon said, "We'll miss you," simply, without elaboration, which was exactly right. Imelda cooked through November and into December, and taught Serena, with the resigned patience of someone transferring institutional knowledge they'd hoped wouldn't be necessary, the specific recipes and household systems that kept the Vale property running. Serena learned to make the salt pork and bean dish that appeared on their table twice a week, not because she especially liked it, but because it was efficient and filling, and Gideon ate it without complaint. She learned where Imelda kept the household account records, which turned out to be in a tin box behind a loose adobe brick in the kitchen wall, which she chose not to find as eccentric as she might have. On Imelda's last night, they ate together at the kitchen table, the three of them, and it was a better meal than usual because Imelda had decided that her final act of household management would be to use the provisions she'd been carefully conserving and make something worth eating. There was roasted chicken and corn pudding and a dried fruit pie that Serena ate 2 pieces of, which she wasn't entirely certain she regretted. Imelda left on a Saturday morning with a single bag and the composure of a woman who had been managing her feelings about departures for longer than Serena had been alive. She embraced Gideon briefly, with the practicality of a person who has known someone long enough for affection to have become matter of fact. She shook Serena's hand. Then she walked to Denny's waiting wagon and didn't look back, because that was how she was. And the wagon took her down the valley road toward town and the stage to Santa Fe, and the house was very quiet in a way that was different from all the other ways it had been quiet over the past 14 months. "Well," Gideon said. "Yes," Serena agreed. She went inside and put the coffee on, because that was what needed doing, and because the kitchen was still the kitchen, and the work was still the work, and the day had to continue regardless of who was or wasn't in it. The letter from Margaret Voss came in January, with the second set of revisions to the 3-season contract, and a brief personal note at the bottom that said, in Voss's compressed handwriting, "The Eastern planning provision you negotiated is smart. Most people don't think that far forward. Whoever taught you to do that knew what they were doing." Serena read the note twice and then folded it into the back of her ledger and didn't mention it to Gideon, not because she was hiding it, but because some things could be kept quietly, as private confirmation. January also brought Dr. Burr from Sacramento, which she hadn't expected. He came as part of a regional survey he was conducting for the Agricultural College, traveling through Nevada Territory Vineyard operations to document recovery patterns after the 1881 flooding that had affected the whole region. He had asked, in a letter, if he might visit the Darrow Valley operation that had corresponded with him so specifically about drainage repair and rootstock selection. She had written back and said yes, of course. Burr was in his mid-50s, compact and precise, with the distracted energy of a man whose mind worked faster than the situations he was placed in. He arrived on a gray January morning and spent 6 hours walking every section of the vineyard, asking questions that revealed how carefully he'd read her letters, noting things in a small field journal with the focused absorption of someone taking a place seriously. At the end of the day, over the coffee that had replaced Imelda's elaborate suppers as the household's primary hospitality offering, he said, "What you've done here in 14 months, the drainage work, the varietal transition, the pruning decisions, this is not standard practice. The approach to the root zone renovation in particular. He paused. Where did you develop this methodology? My father's vineyard, she said, and the specific conditions of this property. I read everything I could find, and then I looked at what was actually in front of me and made decisions. Your father was a trained viticulturist? A farmer, she said. He just paid attention for 40 years. Burr looked at her over his glasses. There are trained viticulturists who don't achieve what you've achieved here. She didn't know what to say to that, so she poured more coffee. Later, when Gideon had excused himself to check on something in the barn, she'd noticed he sometimes did this when conversations became about her specifically, a kind of consideration that she'd come to recognize as deliberate. Burr said, Would you be willing to write up the drainage repair methodology in detail? The approach to identifying subsurface root zone saturation from surface vine indicators. I've not seen it documented this specifically. It should be documented. She looked at him. For the agricultural college? For the record, he said. For the next person standing in a ruined vineyard trying to figure out where the problem actually is. She thought about that. She thought about standing in the eastern rows in October of last year, pressing her palm flat against the soil and feeling the wrong quality of the moisture, the way the knowledge had come not from a textbook, but from her father's voice in her memory saying, when the damage follows a line, it's because something underground is making a line. Yes, she said. I'll write it up. Burr left the next morning, and she sat down that evening after supper and began. Not a formal document. She didn't know the academic conventions for that, and she wasn't going to pretend to, but a clear, specific account of what she'd found at the Vale Vineyard and how she'd found it and what she'd done about it, written the way she would write a letter to someone who was standing in a difficult place and needed to know what to look for. She wrote for 3 evenings. Gideon read it when she was done, not because she'd asked him to, but because he came to the table and picked it up in the way he sometimes picked things up, the way he had his father's ledger with a particular quality of attention. He set it down after a while. This is good, he said. It's accurate, she said. Whether it's good is for Burr to decide. It's both, he said. Not flattery, just the direct way he said things he believed. She sent it to Sacramento in February. Spring came with less drama than the first one, which she interpreted as a good sign. The eastern plantings had overwintered well. She'd checked them obsessively through December and January, the way you check things you've invested heavily in, and they had rewarded the obsession by surviving without significant losses. The graft unions were sound. The dormant wood had the right color and flexibility. When March came and the vines began to wake, the bud break across the replanted rows was more uniform than she'd expected, which told her the root systems were establishing the way she'd hoped. Gideon noticed her walking the eastern rows on a morning in late March and came to find her there. She was crouching at the base of a vine in the 3rd row, watching the first green tips of bud break emerge from the spur positions she'd designated in winter. They're coming, he said. Yes, she said. He crouched beside her and looked at the emerging bud. It was a small, improbable thing. That first green tip, no bigger than a thumbnail, pushing out of wood that had been dormant all winter. She'd seen it hundreds of times in her life, bud break on a vine she'd been waiting on, and it still had the quality of something that surprised her. Not the fact of it, but the fact that the fact of it still mattered to her. 2 more seasons before we see fruit from these, she said. Maybe 3 before it's worth what we put in. I know, he said. He wasn't impatient about it. That was one of the things she'd come to rely on. His specific patience with long timelines, the quality her father had said every vineyard person had to develop or get out. Do you think about the long term, she said, what this looks like in 10 years? He looked at the row of young vines, their bud break progressing down the row in the morning light. I think about it the way you think about something you want to be true but don't want too badly, he said, in case it isn't. She understood that. She had been living in that particular kind of careful hope for most of a year. It will be, she said. She didn't say it the way she said things she was certain of, because she wasn't certain, but she said it the way she said things she believed in deeply despite uncertainty, which was a different and perhaps more honest register. He looked at her. In the spring morning, in the eastern rows that hadn't existed a year ago and now were showing their first green signs of the future she'd argued for, He looked at her the way he sometimes did when something had moved him that he wasn't going to comment on directly. "Yeah," he said. "I think it will too." They stood up together, and the sun was coming over the canyon wall to the east, and the valley was opening into the morning, and neither of them said anything else about it, because it didn't need anything else said. What Serena had learned in the year since she'd stepped down from a stagecoach with one trunk and $32 and the specific desperation of a woman who had run out of other options was this: survival rarely looks like what you expect it to when you're standing at the beginning of it. She had expected to survive by her own competence, which was a reasonable expectation given that competence was what she had. What she hadn't expected was what the competence would cost. The daily weight of being the person who had to know when she didn't know, who had to project confidence while sitting with private uncertainty, who had to hold the vision of what a failing thing could become while everyone around her, including sometimes herself, looked at what it currently was and found it wanting. She hadn't expected to grieve her first husband less here than she had anywhere else, which she understood wasn't a betrayal of him but a function of being fully occupied by work that mattered. She hadn't expected to miss her father more. She hadn't expected Imelda to matter to her. She hadn't expected Will Eustace's 18-year-old curiosity about why planting depth matters to land in a part of her that still had something to teach. She hadn't expected Gideon Vale specifically. She had expected a man with a problem, and she'd found that, but she'd also found a man whose capacity for patience and work and the particular honesty of not needing to be right, whose willingness to say "I'll think on it" and then actually think on it and then come back changed, was something she hadn't known to look for in another person and had found anyway. That was the thing about arriving somewhere broken down and unexpected with no particular plan except to make yourself useful. You couldn't control what you found. You could only control what you brought, and whether you brought it honestly. She had brought everything she had. That was the whole of what she'd done. And it had been, so far, enough. In April, on a morning that was warm enough to work without a jacket for the first time since October, Serena was in the spring section doing the second round of spring shoot positioning, the labor-intensive work of directing new growth to the wire positions she'd designated, tying shoots at the angles that would develop into the cordon structure for the next several seasons. It was the kind of work she didn't mind, the slow and specific kind that required full attention without heavy labor, that let her mind settle into the rhythm of the task while her hands did what they knew. Gideon found her at the far end of the section. He'd been in town. She'd heard the wagon early that morning and hadn't asked, had learned that he came and went on practical errands without requiring commentary. He came down the road toward her with his coat still on, dust from the road on his boots. He handed her an envelope. She looked at it. The return address was Sacramento. She opened it. It was from Dr. Burr, 2 pages, formal enough to have been typed by someone at the college. She read the first paragraph and then read it again. The California Agricultural College was publishing a regional assessment of post-flood vineyard recovery in the Nevada and Arizona territories. They intended to include her written methodology, the drainage repair documentation she'd sent in February, as a case study. Burr's covering note said that 3 viticulture professors had reviewed it and found it to be the clearest field description of subsurface root zone saturation diagnosis he had encountered in 15 years of working in the field. He had included a small honorarium check, which she noted with the specific complex emotion of a woman who had spent a year counting every dollar very carefully. She looked up from the letter. Gideon was watching her. He'd read enough in her face to know something significant had happened, and he was waiting with the patience that had turned out to be one of the most useful things about him. She handed him the letter. He read it. He was quiet for a moment after he finished. "Emmett Crane's daughter," he said, quietly. Not to her exactly, but not to himself. Somewhere between the two, aimed at the truth of it. She felt something tighten briefly in her chest and release. It was not the first time she'd thought about her father this year. She'd thought about him most mornings, standing in somebody else's vineyard doing the work he'd spent 20 years teaching her to do. But this was different. This was the work mattering to people she'd never met. The way her father's work had mattered to her. The way knowledge passed through people into other people and kept going whether or not anyone had intended it to. "He would have been insufferable about it," she said. "He would have told me he always knew I'd do something like this." "Would he have been right?" Gideon said. She thought about that honestly. "Probably," she said. "I would have argued with him anyway." Gideon looked at the letter one more time and then handed it back. He looked around the spring section, the healthy second-year growth, the shoot positioning work she'd been doing, the rows of vines that were going to produce another good harvest this fall and a better one the year after, building year by year into the kind of operation that Robert Hartwell's 3-season contract had assumed was possible. "What do you want to do?" he said. "With the letter. With, he gestured slightly, "what it means." She thought about it. She thought about what it meant to have done the work, and to have the work recognized, and to be standing in a vineyard in April with a letter from Sacramento in her hand, and a man beside her who had trusted her enough to bet everything on her judgment. "I want to keep working," she said. "I want to finish this row. And then I want to write back to Dr. Burr and tell him I'm glad the document was useful. And I want to ask him if the college has interest in a second piece on varietal selection for high desert replanting, because I have things to say about that." Gideon looked at her. The almost smile was there again, the one she'd come to know, the one that meant something that would be expressed by action rather than words. "And after that?" he said. She looked at the row she'd been working on, the neat tied shoots, the developing structure of vines that would be here long after both of them, the permanent patient work of building something that outlasted the builder. "I want to see the eastern rows produce their first harvest," she said. "And then I want to see what comes after that." She turned back to the work, and he came and stood beside her in the row, and she showed him the angle she was tying toward, and he reached past her and tried it on the next shoot, and she corrected his angle without ceremony, and he adjusted it, and the morning moved around them while they worked through the row together. This was the shape of the life they had built, which was not the life either of them had imagined arriving at, and which had come about through loss and practicality and a great deal of manual labor and the specific courage of two imperfect people who had decided, separately and then together, to stop waiting for conditions to be better before they began. The valley stretched out around them in the April light. The spring section was alive with new growth. The eastern rows, those once dead, once condemned, once replanted rows, stood in their second season, young and growing and reaching toward a harvest that was 2 years away but coming. The work was not finished, it was never finished. That was the whole of what you learned, if you stayed with a thing long enough, not that it ended, but that it continued. And that continuing was itself the point, the proof, the thing you'd been building toward all along. Serena Holloway. Vale had arrived in Darrow Valley with one trunk and no certainty, and the stubborn belief that something worth saving could still be saved. She had been right about that. She had been wrong about some things along the way, and she had corrected the errors and kept moving, and the vines had responded to that the way living things respond to being cared for honestly, not with perfection, not with gratitude, not with any kind of dramatic vindication, but with the simple and sufficient fact of growth. That was enough. It was in the end, everything.